All right. Welcome, everyone. Very nice that you're here. And this, we want to start with this table event called "Where is Food on the Menu? Rethinking Food and Food Systems in Climate Action." Happy to welcome you here today. We have a bit of a small crowd. I think it's also due to the autumn holidays and exam week, but we're also joined by around 50 people online, so that's really nice. To introduce myself, my name is Miriam Schoonover-Steiner. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Environmental Policy Group on Food Systems Transformations, and I'm also a researcher at Table. So to introduce Table a bit, Table is an online food systems platform that explores evidence, assumptions, and values that people bring to debates about resilient and sustainable food futures. And this combination of evidence and values is really important. So the approach Table takes is to explore them both and look at how we interpret evidence, judge what's most important, and how this leads to visions for possible and desirable futures. And we think that that's really necessary as food is currently at the heart of interconnected crises such as biodiversity loss, malnutrition, poverty, injustice, and of course climate. So that's what we'll be looking at today. This role of food systems in global climate negotiations. But let me first introduce our facilitator, that's Gillian Student. She's a knowledge integrator and researcher on inter and transdisciplinary research at both the Rethinking Institute for Environmental Climate Research and the Environmental Policy Group. She really focuses at co-creating understanding of complex systems, developing experience for future trajectories. So we thought it's really fitting to have her here today to guide our conversation. Gillian.
Thank you, Miriam. Welcome to our table setting this evening, and I'm joined by three wonderful guests. To my right, we have Sigrid Bergheim-Peck. She's an associate professor in global food system sustainability at the Environmental Policy Group here at Wageningen University. She has experience in multiple countries and in multiple situations, focusing primarily on consumption sociologists, on practices and everyday fair perspective to advance global food system sustainability. And we're looking to hear from you. In the middle is Tansir Sala. He's a very active individual. He's coordinated many events on behalf of youth, both for the Gambia Youth Delegate at UNGO, the UNFCCC. He's also been a Youth Party delegate for SB 58, 60, 62. He also is a task force member of the Global Youth Statement under the UNGO. He has many connections both locally and internationally. We're very interested to hear your perspective, bringing these different voices to the table. And then to my far right is Cindy Au. She is an Innovations Officer at Climate, a think and do tank bridging food and climate to advance a just transition in low and middle income countries. And she works with in her background in economics and business administration, an experience with consultancy and civil society. Cindy brings a multi-perspective approach to linking evidence, innovation, and stakeholder engagement for transformative change in the system. So this is the table. We also have an empty seat for later for you to join the conversation. But we're going to start here because we're at this talk table, not with food yet on the table in the way that we're hoping. So my first question for the panel is from your perspective, and maybe you want to highlight a little bit more the perspective beyond the introduction I've given. Do food and agriculture receive enough attention in international climate in negotiations such as COP? And if so, in what ways do you see food at the table at these climate negotiations? Shall we start with the first person to my right? There's also an extra microphone. So we can also pass these microphones back and forth. Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, like you said, for me, food is just our everyday fare. So climate is our everyday fare. So for me, I wrote years ago a small opinion piece about climate as a dinner guest. And so that is actually vice versa. So climate is at the table, and now we need to bring food to the table of climate. But I think that says it all, because when it's at COP, it's often negotiated from very large, high-level perspectives. And I think what is really important, also if you want to make climate more tangible, is to bring it back to our everyday actions. Because otherwise it remains something that is abstract, also climate change. It remains something that someone else has a responsibility for. So actually food can also enhance the climate discussion. But then you need to acknowledge that it is something that we engage with on a daily basis, and every one of us. So I think that is an important aspect that is currently really missing from discussions, both in food systems as well as in climate system debates.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Good afternoon, everyone. So, like you mentioned, it is also very true because we have the role to play in ensuring that issues surrounding food system and food and agriculture is like gaining momentum in the UN negotiation because I've not been actively following the negotiation on food and agriculture, but I have agriculture as a background and I understand as a member of the International Association of Students in Agriculture and Related Sciences, we've been actively also pushing for the ecosystem agenda towards the negotiation, leading from the World Food Forum and also the COP's negotiations, because over the years they have not been gaining momentum and where they needed attention for the issues and to reflect the audience they needed on the negotiation about what is sustainable food and what is food and agriculture and how do we design the food system innovation structure and what those food system transformation mean. Because these are issues that can definitely see different viewpoints and divergent views leading from the developing countries. Because like for example, Africa and Gambia to be specific, we focus mainly on agriculture, flour production, productivity. We understand what it needs and what importance it is for us to involve in the negotiation and discussion on food system transformation and food and agriculture. But to respond to your question, it is not widely gaining momentum initially before for the discussion on food and agriculture or food system transformation in climate negotiation. But still, parties are committed towards ensuring that the discussion gain momentum in the negotiation, especially with the civil side of the negotiation, like-minded organizations in that sphere.
With a couple of facts. So the treaty has been formed in 1992 already, but then again, food as a standalone agenda item didn't receive attention until 2012. So this was 20 years later, which is, in my opinion, incredibly slow. And only 10 years later, 2023, the first ever food system pavilion, 2022, the first ever food system pavilion was present at COP. And my colleagues luckily did a paper a year ago, which looked at what has happened actually regarding food systems action in COPs. And by the COP of COP 29 last year, there were 14 agriculture workshops so far, multiple reports, as well as an online portal that have happened, and obviously different presidential initiatives, but they are not, legally binding in the same way. So you could say that yes, there are more momentum happening regarding food. it has been incredibly slow, but is it still delivering the results that is needed? I would join my fellow colleagues here by saying that yes, it is definitely not enough, and it is not receiving the kind of attention that we need.
Okay, so some of the things I've heard so far is about bringing these large global perspectives into the everyday is one of the issues that you're not seeing at our table yet, as well as this momentum for youth. And you mentioned about the production market being this focus area and urgency related to your context, the local context. And also this delivery on. So yes, now all of a sudden there are some visible signs after maybe delivering on what it's going to do in transforming things. Why do you think that this is that it's taking so long to make food more visible? Because it's something you do every day.
Yeah, so definitely that social culture and this is that even though we are at some point now realizing that it's important for all the issues are and moving from COP27 was COP28 before that agenda has been that is so, but we understand the regional perspective also the country's perspective in the issues surrounding rural agriculture and what it truly relates and what it defines. Because if you look at the COP negotiations and how it's structured, like for example, the negotiating blocks, like the G7 and China, for example, which is the biggest negotiating bloc in the UN People's Republic. And under the G7 and China negotiating bloc, we have other multiple countries like Gambia, for example, and other African countries. So issues around the agricultural dynamics, it can be a very sensitive topic in a way, because what we need to understand is what those innovative food system means and what those food system transformation means and what those food and agriculture mean in the UN context. And because we understand that food and agriculture, even though it contributes in the global greenhouse gas emission, and it is according to the report, we know so when we talk about food and agriculture production and emission or food and agriculture, what those is truly quantified and what those is be quantified in a more context that people who are into this food system or food and agriculture, for example, the Netherlands, that is also a food producing country, which is producing and also responsible with some of this, it can be a context-based approach. This that is definitely having most of the negotiations on food and agriculture. That is definitely true because when we talk about agriculture contribute to the global greenhouse gas emissions, but the real global greenhouse gas emission and what we're really talking about mostly and what people from the global south and people of the are talking about more is the consequence of industry mostly because if you talk or if you check through variation in some energy. And in that, we need to prioritize how best countries or particular companies reduce their energy production in a way that it does not give great attention to the food and agricultural negotiation. So my own personal point is really that is part of the reason why food and agriculture is not really getting the moment of attention in the United States.
But I think it's about difficulty to quantify different parts of the different initiatives. That's those justifying that and that's hopefully talk later. And the industries that are involved in a lot of food production out coming from large industries and of the energy issues there or prioritized over food. One of the main points from the EAT-Lancet report that came out earlier this month was that the responsibility for planetary boundary transgressions of food systems is not equal. It adds to the richest 30% of the global population contribute to more than 70% of environmental pressures from the food system. Just 1% of the global population can a safe and just space. Some of the, I think, regular points information about the point. And are there other reasons that this table too? Yeah, I think an important part is that food makes it very central. I had also sensitive. Yeah, I need to say that's actually what you are alluding towards as well. So if you can discuss this big and who is responsible and then pointing to each other and discuss where reduction needs to be made. That's an easier discussion when you all have to look. So, okay, how do we go about food across all our countries and how just is this and to what extent is what type of food production consumption system contributing to this global CO2 emission level or other environmental impacts. And that is a highly sensitive issue. So, and then it becomes very apparent because food is what we need every day. So injustices in food are very sensitive. And I think that is also a reason why food is often treated as a separate system and not immediately on the climate. So there are a lot of discussions we have like the City Summit and so on. So it is actually being like separate entity, and we need more integrated approaches. And of course, we have had more time and debates to what extent there is climate change. So a lot of the early
speaking up.
how much climate change is there?
I change.
And that's a real different discussion, and that is much more sensitive to local context. Something you would like to add?
Well, that's the thing. I feel like everything needs to be addressed here. So that kind of like the sensitivity of the complexity of the system as well. Like we can't really see that this kind of system is needed globally, but we're looking at, you know, like the whole like implications, frictional implications as well as the like well. So it is a sensitive and complex topic. But yeah, I also kind of like understood that for the early days of COP, which was treated, as you as well mentioned earlier, kind of part of some other negotiations, and it wasn't an item on the scope. So I think structurally, I guess that also COP just didn't really treat, you know, like leave room for those kind of discussions. So, what thinking of, we see that there's issues that we brought to the table. I just like to be a little asking what can food give the bread to the table, this is our concept that we are discussing. If you just take a moment for everyone in the audience, also online, to just think, we discussed why some of these food isn't prominent, some of the issues that have delayed the delivery of food in our mindset. I would like to turn to what a win was on the menu more prominently and more explicitly on what would it be like, what would it taste like, what would you envision for being important things that would it be the taste things, would we be thinking about this is a side additions to it,
If it is the end part of the beginning of the conversation, or is it about the ingredient? The ingredient that we're going to have, sort of focus area, types of food that we need to bring in central food. Or do you envision something about the process area? How do we get to the table of all? And they also hear vision of this. It doesn't matter who you're at the table with, and who's not at the table. Where it comes from, or where we're eating it. Give yourself a moment to imagine the really what where things is. And as it's handy to use metaphors and metaphor visible, I would like to ask our my dear guests at this table to bring that item that's brought up to the related and just tell what it is that this all right. Who would like to start?
For example, like normally living but what is what like in a control and what it is. And you cannot talk about food excluding water in the food system. For example. So the reason why I decided to bring water and also it really contributes a lot in our own performance and our own everyday life. Without food and water, I was told by my teacher when I was learning for my high school, without food and water we will die. And then it later informed and confirmed that water constitutes about 75% of our nutrition, which is really important for us to understand that we cannot sideline the issue of water in the food system and food and agricultural negotiation and discuss in that aspect. So I decided to bring in water in the table so that we could side by side because in the agricultural and the local context, food, it is something, because Gambia, for example, almost about 75% of our population depend on agriculture for their survival. And in that, we realize that issues surrounding our agricultural production, we are a rain-fed nation, whereas without rainfall, we cannot embark on any of our agricultural production or productivity, especially the rural farmers who are doing agriculture. Without water in their gardens, the agricultural production is meaningless. We have a very fresh water in Gambia, but the irrigation system is not developed in a way that farmers can go in with their agricultural production as it's supposed to be. You see this beautiful one here. It is because there was rain, but there was water that developed it to this stage until it is harvested. I believe water contributes meaningfully in our everyday food.
Yes, I think.
And I think because of food, we often think about food to chew on, but actually that's a lot of food essentially what food is for. Yeah, why I brought this courgette is actually because yeah, it was laying in my vegetable garden and I just ignored it. And actually my father found it. And it made me think about something that a student once did a research about. And she said yeah, it's so funny that we have vegetable gardens now in the Netherlands as being promoted, have more sustainable food systems. But when it just doesn't work, we walk to the supermarkets and we buy something. So is this really about food sustainability or food security? And then I did a research in Ukraine, especially in the eastern parts of Ukraine, and there maybe we automatically associate climate change with the global south, like countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. Yeah. But it's also hitting very severely in Central and Eastern Europe. So, and Ukraine is one of the countries that's really suffering from droughts. And also that is now compounded by crises such as the war, impacts on vegetable gardens. Fresh food is not available that much anymore because of electricity disturbances, so you see how everything hangs together. And then someone said, we always had our vegetable garden, but now I depend so much on this vegetable garden, I feel how severely climate change is hitting it, because now we depend on it and we see that the yields are down at least 50% compared to previous years, but we now depend on it. And I think it is important that we do not externalize these developments and these issues around sustainability, security, and climate change to other continents, but as we are here sitting in the Netherlands, in this super large producing, food producing country, we need to realize what's going on. And this is something that I have to push for, to just neglect good food in my garden. But yeah, that's also kind of unsustainable in certain ways. So that's why I wrote my push it.
Wow, this is a great bruschetta, and I really loved it how you both brought like food as well as energy topics into the table. I also this afternoon was wondering like, what do I have if I, have it, and what can I really bring? This little tiny grains of rice that were left, and I was like, bingo. I think rice is an excellent kind of food item that really brings together the problems. People know that it is a main contributor of methane. It is something that is nutritionally sensitive to many people in the world. It is using a lot of different fertilizers as well. So it's really bringing together a lot of these different topics that we really want to think about when we are thinking or imagining together what would be sustainable future in agriculture like across the globe. And I think methane especially is a very interesting greenhouse gas. It is estimated that 1/3 of food system greenhouse gases are actually coming from rice production as well as enteric methane from livestock production. And there have been some kind of movements around different, global movements and initiatives around UNFCCC structure as well. There was a global methane pledge at COP26 as well. But then again, when, it brought together, what did I write? 159 countries, and I checked the Netherlands is part of this as well. But when we look at the Netherlands, what we're seeing is that the emissions are just going up, especially, and the livestock sector is increasing as well. So I think this comes back to maybe when you asked about what is also the process like of preparing this food. This is also talking to the kind of idea that we might be more tracking when it comes to these different pledges and initiatives as to what is actually happening and what is just lipstick on a pig.
I'm just challenged on one thing, because I can actually agree that we all often talk production, and production is the problem. And I would like to say that consumption is the problem, because as long as it's being produced and it's being consumed somewhere, the whole food system only exists because we all consume. And that's not being done in a just way. But I think we need to bring consumption to the table. Otherwise, we keep on externalizing the problem to someone else. And also, when we talk consumption, it allows us to see these injustices. It allows us to see informalities in food system. It allows us to see our responsibility in these systems and to not reveal to, okay, there are large methane emissions, they're not. So I really think the urgency is now to make ourselves all responsible to this quest. And I feel that is seriously missing.
You both really answered it, and I will also reiterate your point about consumption. Consumption is important, but also the end result of consumption, sometimes the way we consume also does not commensurate with how better we maintain our carbon footprint, for example, because almost about half of the food we actually consume at some point goes to waste. which is like, leading to food waste, whereas, we overconsume or we actually request for things that we at some point do not need to consume. So we eventually lead to food waste, because the issues about how we dispose this wasteful or the food that is not being consumed also contribute a lot in how we are talking about our emission and all that. We have a responsibility to play in our everyday life. How many of us those for the food that we know that we can consume, rather than just overly producing or overly ordering food and then we don't throw it at the dustbin. So it goes side by side. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to add to that point.
I'm really excited about this conversation. So just gonna continue. I really love how you both are also bringing the whole value chain approach. So from production to consumption and the whole value chain, and post-harvest losses as well. Like, how do we manage all that when it comes to emissions? And wait, I had an idea. It's escaping my mind. Yes, so when it comes to consumption, what I also find interesting when we're talking about these different products that have a very high intensity of emissions as well, let's say like animal-based foods. So we know that the global population is growing, and the middle class, which is likely to increase the demand for animal-based foods in different countries. So I'm just wondering, what would be kind of like your envisioning then? Like, how would it, the kind of like sustainable and just food future look like in different regions around the world, since it's very different, if I can ask?
I think also here it goes from who eats what, where, and why. And so I normally say, if you want to talk about the future food system, you need to think, what do people where need? And also according, of course, to cultures, etc. But so we're not thinking about how can we currently produce to make it more sustainable, that is already happening, but also what would we need where in the future? And does that need this large global transportation, or could, for instance, could sorghum be a more suitable solution than wheat from Ukraine for Northern African countries, for instance, these kind of questions, but also in relation to nutrition. So where are what nutrition needs? So we have been pumping a lot of milk into Asian countries, and one can question to what extent this is really suitable. Because it's our overproduction in powdered milk that's being produced into sugar sweetened milk beverages, and then make people believe that that is so good for growth and health, and then countries will suffer from stunting. That's the way forward. But of course, there are also populations that need, for instance, more meat consumption because it's good for their health. But it doesn't mean that they have to go to the extent of our levels of meat consumption, or even worse in the United States. So I think it is more about how can we get to more balanced diets. And then, of course, you get back to the large corporations also, they are involved, to our regulations around what food should look like, all these kind of bigger issues and more corporate and regulated issues are also in play. But it is this debate that we need. So what does it mean for people at the table? Where in the world? Where do we see more developments? How can we then ensure that there is right and culturally appropriate nutrition on the table? And what role is there then for also large corporations to play in it? And now we flip nutrition actually standardly. And I would also challenge to look at it from just the other sides around. Just to
Just to add to that point as well. So my little contribution will be about food chain, because normally it's really important, most especially Africa or Gambia to be specific. Most of our food that we consume every day is being imported. We rarely produce our locally available food for our consumption. Almost more than 70% of our food that we eat every day, it is imported either from China, either from the United States, or either from Europe, or whatever. So I believe what we can do better is to reduce the food value chain. to promote more locally produced food because it's sustainable, it's also healthy, and it reduces a lot of carbon emission because most of the food, especially even in the Netherlands, for example, that produce animal products or whatever, but even with their animal farming, there are some of the products that they need, it is actually outsourced. How many of us knows the food that we eat every day, how many kilometers or how many miles those goods travel to reach here for us to consume? We are just consuming, but we don't even know the food we are eating, where is it coming from. So I think the way forward is for us to ensure that we locally produce food locally and ensure that at least those within the food system can be improved and also have a more sustainable way of agricultural production. Otherwise, it is honestly difficult with this, how do you say, trade war between China, for example, the United States, Russia, you name them. They're just trying to play with our minds and our own economy. Like Africa have the potential to produce their own food, to even feed the world. But almost our everyday food consumption comes from Asia, comes from the United States or Europe, which is like insane. Because we have the resources, we have the land, we have everything it takes to develop our own or produce our own food for local consumption. But sadly, that's not the reality, and we have a long way to go.
A couple of things I'm hearing in our table discussion is about what about the healthy food part? What about what you said so far about the item you brought to the table? And what do you bring in relation to healthy food to the crop? Because that seems to be one of the underlying issues of healthy food. So how do we bring healthy food with these things in mind to crop negotiations?
So there are a lot of things that can be said about that, and I think I'm very excited to hear what you will bring about like nutrition, perspective as well. But I think one gateway in is as well that it has been shown with some crops as well, like nature crops, that higher levels of CO2 concentrations in air will also lower the nutritional value in some crops. So that is definitely one of the perspectives that you can bring into as a justification that nutritional value might decrease as well, which would be a major concern. So although in the future it might be that some regions will actually gain more land to produce food or like to cultivate some crops that they wouldn't have been able to do before, it's definitely not just a win solution.
Yeah, you actually mentioned a very important point. So I am also particular about what it means when we talk about healthy food, because it is important for us to understand what it translates to the local communities and people who are into the food and agricultural value chain system and the issues surrounding food system transformation, for example. So I have a background in agriculture, and I used to work under the Ministry of Agriculture back home. And there were some projects that were within the agricultural department that normally help farmers, especially with the early improved varieties, early maturing crops, for example, because before we normally register a lot of rainfall, but due to the impact of climate change and all that, our agricultural production has drastically reduced, and we rarely even register more than 1,200 millimeters of rain, because we rarely have 4 months constant rainfall. What they do, or what they did, was to at least bring in projects that help farmers and communities more in climate smart agricultural output to support them with early maturing crops, whereas at least some of these crops can grow and be harvested within a period of 2 months, for example. I believe when we have some of these approaches developed in a way that at least it can, because the issues about that also goes with approaches where some of these things are highly investigated and also tested. because seed testing and also certification is really important for having a healthy diet. Because you don't just say, okay, these are agricultural crops and all that, but it has to be, certified in a more registered certifying agencies to ensure that it is medically proven that have some impacts in our own health. That is the way to see that at least we improve in our food system and the food system transformation. Whereas it does not lead to us having this back and forth conversation and debates about our agricultural food system or health diet regarding. Because I have been closely following COPs and COP28 to be specific, where we had a campaign under the Food at COP initiative or movement where we talk about what is the food we consume at COP. And you'll be amazed to know that we say the UN Climate Conference, which is definitely the body that's responsible to ensure that we regulate our carbon emission and our footprint and all that. But most of the food that they serve at COP contradict the negotiation that we're talking about, which is so funny. So when we're talking about how do we bring the agenda of food at COP, we have to first talk about the table where we're talking about food and agriculture. How does it define food itself? The food that is served at COP, for instance, does it really justify what we're talking about? Those are things that we need to point out to the politicians and to the parties to make sure that let it really translate to the agenda that they're talking about food system. Otherwise, it's just political games to bring in people to talk about food and agriculture or whatsoever, but it doesn't really translate to the real problem that we're talking about. So that.
I can completely relate to this, because when you did the imagination game, I was imagining that they were all sitting around the table eating food and then being confronted with what they are eating and what it all relates to, and then unpacking that. So that's. But getting to your question about climate and health, actually, I always loved the EAT-Lancet report, not because the precise guidelines, but because the hope that they actually provide. So a healthy planet is healthy food. So it is such a win-win. So it always amazes us when something is so obvious and such a win-win. How come we go so hardly against it? So I think that is really mind-boggling, but that says something about mankind. But then if you really think about it, so we are hit by climate change. That's certain facts are irreversible. Yeah, we need to accept it. So then I see sometimes farmers who produce different types of crops that are actually super healthy, more healthy than the normal crops that we would then produce. And then also they are very good for the soil health, so for soil biology. So I think, okay, that's possible. So that's all hopeful and nice. But then on the other hand, I also experienced how severe weather events wiped out complete harvests of farmers. And then we talk about small-scale farmers, because most of the produce in the world is still being produced by small-scale farmers. So they know that the storm is coming. They know it, but they don't have enough labor to get the harvest in. They don't have the storage to store the harvest. And actually the varieties that they produce are not suitable for storing. So they invest a lot in seeds, they invest in the planting, but then their whole harvest is gone. So what do? They quickly replant. And they use a lot of agrochemicals to to stimulate growth. And there they jeopardize food safety. So if we really want to address this very seriously, we need also to mind these small-scale farmers who lose a lot of their harvest, who are forced to use a lot of agrochemicals because they need to earn back their investment and they don't have the luxury to go to the bank. So climate is cause and consequence at the same time, and so I think it is also in that holistic perspective that we need to look at it. But that is not easy, and when things are not easy, we rather get them off the table because we like to think in causalities. If A, then B. And that is I think with food and health, it seems so obvious, but it is highly complex, and with climate change increasing, it becomes more complex every day.
I think all of you touched on this sensitivity, the sore spot. What if we bring food to the COP table? What do you think is this sensitive spot that we really need to do something with if we're going to get further to food transformation.
Yeah, I can kick off because I have just one simple answer, and that's decentralized knowledge. I really think we need to have a different idea about what is knowledge, about addressing climate change, about mitigating it, about creating justice. We really need different voices at the table. So there are always the usual suspects that are there, and I think from, like now, I'm quite cynical. We know what is all being done to get the COP in Brazil, and it makes me sad. And so I would rather say the best thing for climate is almost to boycott the COP. And there's also a lot to say to go there, but I do not believe that the COP is going to resolve our problems. I think we really need to find a way to have decentralized knowledge and understand, because often when I do research with very localized perspectives, people say, but we know how to do it. We know how, or we can. And that is just not being heard. And I think that is now important. We need to let go of our arrogance that we know what is the problem and that we know how to fix it. And I think if we are honest and look ourselves into the mirror, then you seek support and you seek exchange and you seek where there is friction or where there is a real problem and you dare to address it. And I think that is urgently needed, but that is really outside the current comfort zone. So I'm very much aware that this is not an easy task.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with your point, and honestly, I would just reiterate what you mentioned about the COP not possibly solving our problem. And I just resumed from Germany for the local conference of youth in climate change. We gathered about 1,400 young people across Germany to discuss about what the climate crisis are all about and how we as young people can meaningfully take part in addressing some of the concerns. Even though we know that there was one workshop that I attended that was about the farm COP. It was really interesting to know that majority of participants there were mentioning that COP is not the real place that some of these problems can be solved. And it is overwhelming and interesting to know and also to imagine how these issues, because sadly COP is the only avenue we have to discuss about climate-related policies in a more real action-oriented way. But I believe there can be more way and progressive approach to ensure that COP really solves the urgent problem that we are faced with, ranging from climate change and whatever. Because the COP agenda is designed in a way that is consensus-based, whereas parties have to come and agree unanimously. But that's not true, because the negotiations on the urgency and some of these priorities, both from the developing countries, we call them, we cannot be in a consensus in climate negotiation. We just have to compromise, but there is no way that all parties agree on to an agenda either, because it is structured in a way that it just misleads people and participants and delegates. But say, okay, it was unanimously agreed, but that's not true. Countries don't, or parties don't unanimously agree. Some parties tend to compromise for negotiations to proceed. Different from the UN General Assembly, where it goes with majority vote. But the issues I will just reflect it back from COP29, with even some countries from the global south, the G77 and China negotiated club. Some countries were working out from the negotiation room because of some of the demands not met and all that. We have to really delay the process to a state that it is not really the problem that they work out, but it is about not taking the urgent needs of people who are struggling with these issues. So to answer your question, it is about bottom-up upward. Whereas some of these people who are in the front line working on agricultural system are bringing in the negotiation room. They are supposed to be a table where they given a right seat to sit and discuss with politicians and policymakers about what those food and agriculture mean to them, and what those sustainable food production means to them, and how do we as parties and stakeholders come together to ensure that there is a new path to follow, whereas it could be a win-win. It can be difficult at some point, especially with smallholder farmers. It can be difficult for them to, be in a situation where we feel like they have to be improved in a way that it will improve their economy in different ways. Because, like, for example, most farmers in the Gambia are smallholder farmers, whereas they have a very little scale agricultural production, mostly for family consumption and a little for selling. But the big corporates are the problem here, and they have to be there with the smallholder farmers and discuss on issues that can really solve and address their problem, whereas it does not have to fall back to the smallholder farmers, because otherwise you cannot stop a farmer in my nearest village with the production that they've been into for the past centuries and tell them, like, these are the new policies in agriculture, we have to stop this and that, and it can be really conflicted and contradicted. So they have to be brought in the negotiation table, hear about their concern in a more indigenous knowledge and approach way to understand that their minds and ideas also matter in the negotiation. So, yeah.
Excellent points, I really like those. I think it's a bit similar, I would say, like my answer as to like what is the sensitive topic that would need to be poked and discussed about as well. It's a bit similar to what Tanzir was saying. So it has to do with power relations and changing the existing structure. So really like looking into, for example, well, this is not necessarily part of COPs always, but you know, like in global negotiations and in global rooms, essentially like looking into where is the money flowing, what are the current structures. So for example, if we look at subsidies, there are a lot of like discussions already about like harmful subsidies, where they're going. Are they going into, let's say, agrochemical inputs, which are not helping soil health always either, although they're still necessary in many places in the world. And let's say import as well. So, you know, like, what if we could still like more, so like use these existing resources to enhance local production? So the problem is that there are these winners and there are always losers when it comes to changes. And the people and the organizations and structures which are currently benefiting from the status quo are not willing to change that up super easily. And that is my opinion. And that is why I totally agree, like we should hear from the, you know, both from the member states which don't have such a strong position in negotiations, as well as from smallholder farmers, and bring their voices into these negotiation rooms as well, so that we can really make sure that they're serving the people and the places where it's the most needed to change.
Yeah, you triggered me again. I like this conversation because you talk about member states, and you talked about also about youth, and those 2 points really trigger me because that relates also to my own research. I work a lot also with youth perspective, because if we look at the population in the world, luckily a very large portion is young. And having ambitions and wanting to change. So I think we need to capitalize on that. And the other aspect is, I don't know if we only need to talk about nation states. So what we see, the movement of urban areas, of urbanization, is really large. I think the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact was just superb. It is not only in its power in what it all acts towards, but it's also about how cities can network. So cities are responsible for their citizens. With most of the global population living in cities, city authorities are very important in addressing food, mobility, climate, in its all complexity. And so having maybe cities at the table, or these cities deals at the table, who understand what it means, how it touches down locally on their citizen lives, how it then also brings very tangible, contextual issues to the table, I think it's highly relevant. Because then you bring the discussion a bit away from the stakeholders in traditional value chains, like you are the wrongdoers, and you are the wrongdoers, and you need to listen to them, but to what does it mean for an ecosystem in which we live, in which we thrive, in which how we consume food and other things. But I think that is really an avenue that we should embrace, also in this global UN debate. So I was also wondering, so we just had, it was last week in Rome, the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, and other meetings were there. So maybe we need to bridge those different discussions a bit more, because I think that are the lived realities that can be brought to the table when you engage with private sector players, when you engage with civil society organizers, when you engage with policymakers that have to interact on a daily basis. And I think this is really a promising avenue to maybe, get it.
Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll ask you.
No, but I really like that idea because what I think you have been saying so far is that we need cities and municipalities around a similar kind of a table discussing what is the food that we're being served and we're eating. And I would really love that. Wonderful.
Yeah, and so what I hear about this sense of urgency, we want to talk about the taboos at our table, or at the table at COP. With mentioned decentralized knowledge, and we need to bring that in, bottom up, not just the top, and recognizing these power relations. However, the table at COP is set up in a certain way where it's, there's certain rules to getting into that table. It's a bit fancier than this. You may not be able to sit at these different parts. So, as these three things are really key, what would it take to make these lived experiences, these less empowered individuals, or these bottom-up initiatives, have a way of speaking at this table?
I can quickly go, then my colleagues can go from there. So yeah, I actually have been following the UN climate negotiations, and even though it's funny, but like most of the COPs are highly participated by global North countries. That's a fact. People, especially the representation from the youth and the young people from the global South is less. And these are people who are currently living with the realities of the impact of climate change, either from agriculture, whatever it may be, loss and damage, whatever it could be, migration, for example. We are losing our young generation due to the impact of climate change, and that's a fact. Like, I will take reference from my country, the Gambia, which is a youthful population, about 60% or more than 60% of our population as young people. But recently, for the past 2-3 years, we have experienced the worst case of migration from the Gambia leading to the Mediterranean Sea, coming to Europe, inside of Queen, for example. These are all realities that what forced them to move is because of the impact of climate change. And as I mentioned earlier on, most of our farming communities, or most of our people, about 70% or more of Gambians are into agricultural production. And most of these people are rural farmers, where they entirely depend on agriculture for their survival. So, but recently there is no hope for the agricultural production. It has forced a lot of these young people to move, to migrate. And in that, to bring in more real perspective of that, giving these people the opportunity to participate in their country delegation program, to be part of the negotiation, to bring in real perspective and real life situations, like problem that they are faced with, bringing in fresh ideas and situations and narrating their own stories will impact change if need be. Because you cannot decide for me what I am facing when I know that I'm not given the opportunity to be in the negotiation role. I should be given the opportunity to be there, because most young people who attend COPs or SBs are observers. They are not even in the negotiation. But what we could do is to include these young people or youth or farmers in the country delegation as party delegate, to be in the negotiation role, to bring in fresh ideas and perspective, to ensure at least their ideas and problems and concerns are addressed. Otherwise, it's just difficult, like parties or states will decide on what should be done when people who are impacted directly, their voices are not heard. So, yeah.
So if I understand correctly, the representatives are not able to bring these opinions and values to the table, so that we actually really need somehow these space for these people to also be at negotiations. What are some thoughts from the other members of the team, because considering the difficulties of being in a COP setting, also a very quick dinner. It's only a few days, and then they have to make some big decisions. How do you see?
Yeah, some different reflections. So first of all, I think the COP has a meaning. So I was just before I was a bit critical, but it also has a meaning because when there are certain agreements, whether people completely align with it, is there, but there is a kind of common set agenda, and I think that is important. So we need this large meetings. What we saw happening with the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021 was super fascinating, because there was a lot of critique on who had a seat on the table and whose knowledge was being valued and who was heard. And that critique was so loud that way before even the date of the UN Food Systems Summit was announced, there was a lot of expression on other knowledges around in the world. So actually it triggered the voicing of different insights. And I think that if that UN Food Systems Summit hadn't happened, that hadn't happened around the UN Food Systems Summit. So I think that is also really, really important. So it was also a reason to stand up and voice. So I think that is also important to keep in mind. And secondly, we should not have the illusion that a COP is going to resolve everything. It is important that people talk about climate. It is important that climate is acknowledged as a hot topic that we need to address urgently within all different domains. That shouldn't excuse us working in the food domain to also talk climate when we talk food. So to bring food also then to the climate table, and then indeed we could be a bit more thinking more out of the box in inviting delegates and the luxuries of table setting. And because I'd like to give one example of what I mean, and that is that years ago I was invited by an embassy to talk about entrepreneurship. And to talk about entrepreneurship, they invited employees from the large corporations. And then I told them, if you want to understand entrepreneurship, you have the wrong people at the table, because these are the people with stable salaries, their children go into international schools, they have no idea what it is to be an entrepreneur. So if you need these large corporations because you want to make a bit of noise and for their names, bring them also to the table. But if you really want to understand entrepreneurship, then bring entrepreneurs to the table. And that is actually how I see it also a little bit at the COP. You need the large state representatives, you need the large corporation representative also to be there. But if you really want to understand also how to tackle, not only to measure what's there or to discuss new kind of parameters, you need to also bring these type of voices to the table who have experience and who also doubt, maybe don't know how to deal with it. But these that I can discussion over.
Well, this is a great question. I think we have already heard some very good answers actually. So there are actually two kind of like different things that I would like to maybe like suggest as a way that we could bring out maybe like more experienced bottom-up voices to these different arenas. Like considering that the existing system is as it is and it's very difficult to enter. There is actually just this new Voices for Just Rural Transition project that has been launched. It's together with FTDO, the University of Leeds and Climate is also supporting that. We're bringing marginalized voices to different high-level agendas as well. So that's one way that you can try and bring these different perspectives and ideas while they wouldn't have a direct invitation to the tables just yet. But this also reminded me that I once heard, I'm not sure actually like the details of the story, but I heard that there were these kind of like shadow COPs that were organized as well with a random selection. So you would just get an invitation in your letterbox saying like, hey, you have been selected as a delegate to this shadow COP meeting. So these participants were able to practice kind of like direct democracy as well and vote on these different items related to like climate change and justice questions. And well, from what I heard, that these kind of like results of this shadow crop were actually that the results were more ambitious when it comes to climate change. So it's very interesting to imagine as well, like what if we had just regular people at the table as well, what it could result to as well.
Different dinner guests to this. And I'd also like to open up this table because we want to bring you into this discussion. We have an MDC. And the question, you can either ask a question to the panel or also bring, when we had this visioning moment, what was your vision of the thing that needs to be brought to this table that maybe hasn't been covered yet? So we will continue, if you would like to, then there is a seat. After a moment, someone else wants to come, we'll just tap on the chair and we'll let that person, because you want to give some space to different people to join the conversation. So just, and online, is there contact with online? Or if there is something from online that we can also try to bring in this global perspective locally and see what we can do that. So this is a moment that we also like to open up with this conversation. So if you speaking
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Clark Halpern. I'm a PhD student there at Botany, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I really enjoyed seeing the food that you brought here today. Something that really jumped into my head as we were discussing this and the vast complexity of food systems and the solutions for climate action that come from food systems is oftentimes there's other guests that come from this agriculture, forestry, and land use. Thinking when we're talking about the bioeconomy at the top, which is such an important subject that they're discussing. When we're talking about agriculture, it's not just food that's being produced, it's biofuels. These biofuels, they can promise, these great, climate reductions. And so I was wondering, well, how can food really compete as this at the table then when we're talking to these maybe more simple, things that are being offered?
Give them a moment to chew on that idea. That need to digest.
Can I just quickly ask, is this what your PhD is about as well?
It is not at all.
Very interesting, but that's a very good question actually, but I think what we would need to kind of like evaluate in those situations is, kind of like the different trade-offs that you get, So we know that climate change is not the only problem that we're facing. Also, biodiversity loss and other kind of issues that are happening at the same time. So really, I think we need to be discussing and like take more of these complexities into account as well when doing like different evaluations as to what is needed and where. Another thing is that I think it's important to look at the markets. So for example, from what I've heard, I'm actually not sure, but whatever. I'm from Finland, and what I heard is that in Finland, we are producing also a lot of crops, and majority of them are actually going to animal feed. And this is simply because it's paying the farmers better. So it is very interesting to hear about as well, like what are the different incentives for them, and where are these different crops being produced to? Like is it for biofuels? Is it for producing, for animal feed, or is it for direct human consumption?
Yeah, I may have, it's not my full field of expertise, some reflections. So one is related to how we deal with nature within nation states. So for instance, in the Netherlands we have the nitrogen crisis, and then we talk about we need to have different farming systems and so on. So actually what happens then is also, like I oversimplify it, so don't take it all too literally, but farmers then might go to countries in Eastern Europe, like Romania, and Romania is actually the only country with what we would say real nature still there. So there we damage the nature to do what's not allowed anymore to do in the Netherlands. So this is super oversimplified, but it is the way it is. At the same time, there they have a lot of smallholders farms, allotment gardens, informal economy, and now in the Netherlands we're trying to create it. So what are we doing? So take a different perspective and understand that even within the European Union, there is no EU, there is diversity, and how can we harness this diversity? So that's one reflection. Then another reflection is related, I think, to you already mentioned water. I now also will mention land as the most scarce resources of the future. And that's not energy because there will be sun. So given that land is so valuable, you indeed get competing with land. What do you do with the land? Even in the Netherlands, where we actually created a new province just from the sea. We retrieved it for food production, and now it's a lot of solar panel there. So that's also a contested area. We see the same, for instance, in Ukraine, where they have a lot of land, and the land needs to pay through exports for the war to continue, for maybe later the reconstruction of the country. So you need to sell the land, then who's buying and who's investing in the land? There are investment corporations also importantly. These investment corporations, they do not care whether it's food or fuel. So we also need to mind all these dimensions behind it that create kind of perversities in our systems. And so my work is more from consumption perspective, but these issues I do mind because I think this is where it gets definitely also major meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. One of the issues that keeps coming back is diversity, and also appreciating different cultures and contexts with food. And my question for panelists is, how do we, as it seems also in the recent EAT-Lancet report, of really respecting and appreciating diversity, and at the same time dealing with this global emergency, where do you see this coming up in potential COP discussions for recognizing this diversity? As it doesn't seem like the one global solution for food.
I don't think it has to go to that direction. So I don't know if that should be on the COP table. I think the importance is that food is an important contributor and is actually contributing to climate change and also suffering from climate change. And that is what we need as mankind to survive. So I think it is very strange to ignore it. But the solutions do not necessarily all have to come from the COP. It's like this COP is like this magic box that's going to solve it all. I think the importance of the COP is that we all agree what are certain issues, what are certain causes, but that not necessarily the solutions need to be one size fits all. And it's also important that we therein open up also discussions about vulnerabilities or not knowing or discussing or actually creating ongoing exchange of knowledge. I think that is much, much more important. So to be honest, if I see current, also in our politics, how we are kind of becoming defensive and also in knowledge exchange becoming more excluding, we should feel engaging. I think at this moment we need to engage with every knowledge that's there around the table. We need to have very open doors and about exchange, how things can change in a certain context. Because at the COP table, you don't have the knowledge about small, maybe villages in Gambia or even in a village in the Netherlands or a city in Vietnam, or you do not have that knowledge at that moment, and you need that knowledge to address real problems with real people, and these real people, they also vote. So I think it is not about providing the solution, but opening up the exchange of knowledge that is truly important. And maybe also we try to push too much pressure on the COP to deliver the solution. But we are all there for the solution. So I don't know. I still think the COP is important, but I don't know if the COP is the solution for our food systems. But I do think that food should be there.
You actually perfectly said, and it was really nice to have our colleague on the table as well, so to hear some different perspectives. So just to quickly reflect on your point that you mentioned about the question, I believe you touched upon the one that already popped in my mind, that is about the knowledge gap. Because there is a big knowledge gap between smallholders and also states like governments, and also with the entire structure of our COP. Because I don't really totally oppose the idea of COP, because it is the avenue we have to discuss about climate policies and how we can bring in real solutions towards the climate crisis, like global greenhouse gas emission and all that. COP is there to give us the policies, but it goes way more than just COP decisions. It has to be reflected on the ground. That is like, the political will needs to be there. Like, for example, if a country is not focused, or their main agenda is not about how they can bring in real progress in the urgent crisis that we face, we can have the most beautiful COP outcome. But if the political will is not there, nothing will happen on ground. And I think that is also part of the main problem we are faced with. You can see it like some countries where they don't have real agendas about how best they can improve on their food system, or how best they can improve on reducing their global greenhouse gas emissions. No shaming, no naming anyway, but that's the real thing. So if the political will is not there, we can have the best COP outcome, but real progress will be questionable. And the other point is about bringing in youth voices together. Like, for example, I am part of your group, part of the global coordination team, and every year we produce the global youth statement. That is like on different thematic areas: food and agriculture, adaptation, mitigation, loss environment, migration, whatever you mean, climate, peace and security. We have different youth demands that reflect the urgency and the priority of young people in the climate crisis, because we are frontline fighting for climate change and whatsoever. But if our efforts are not recognized, it is difficult for us to definitely bring in meaningful solutions towards the problem that we're talking about. And I will always want to give reference to COP29. Last year, when the outcome or the first draft text was out, there was no mention of youth. We as youth, we are not mentioned in any of the text that was out, that was draft text. That definitely was disappointing for young people who are in the front line fighting for climate change, day in, day out. We insanely produce a lot of demands to ensure that our efforts are recognized. We are not asking for us to be given allowances, but we just need that recognition and be given the opportunity to make our voices heard. But if we are not recognized, it's like a big problem. And any progressive nation that does not meaningfully take advantage of their youthful population is a failed nation. And we cannot be sidelined in the issues and COP decisions or processes that directly impact our current and our future generation. And parties have to take advantage of our demands and our call to ensure that the problem we are facing and the problem we are addressing will translate to real action. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a new dinner guest. Yeah, you can introduce yourself and then either.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Marcos. I'm from Mexico. Yeah, hence my avocado socks. And I work at Rethinking in social economic research, and I do research on food system transformation, diets, and I would like to know, put on the spot, the role of traditional diets, traditional practices on this conversation. So I'm from Mexico, and then I know, for instance, the Lancet diets. I mean, we knew it. I mean, the traditional diet in Mexico is already aligned with the Lancet concept. I also know some multi-cropping practices in agriculture aligned with sustainability. So I'd like to know what do you think about the role of these traditional diets or traditional foods and practices in this whole conversation?
So I think the whole diet conversation is very, very interesting and super, relevant and topical as well. So you earlier mentioned, Gillian, that the EAT-Lancet report 2.0 just came out, and they also mentioned or evaluated there that although they were describing what the global ideal diet could look like, only 1% of the global population would actually have right now is following it, whether it's because of opportunities or decisions, I do not know. But, what the reality is really looking like what is nutritionally needed as well as what is important for the climate, that's a very interesting topic that needs to be kind of like tied into different processes, I think. And for example, like, you know, looping back to the whole COP discussion, I think like we do have like kind of like two entry points, both like when we're looking at like nutrition as well as like food agenda in general. Like there are these kind of like global opportunities or entries where, for example, we have these negotiations, the, you know, like different like consensus-based or semi-consensus-based discussions as well. But I think during those conversations, you cannot really take the complexity into account that we were just discussing as well, when it comes to different diets or different farming systems. But then again, when you look at like national opportunities, some of them are linked to different UNFCCC processes as well, like national adaptation plans or nationally determined contributions. And they can at least go to the country level and really think about, okay, what are the kind of diets that are needed here, as well as how can we really make sure that climate change is being, you know, taken into account at the same time. So bringing, for example, nutritional language into these different kind of like climate, well, you know, processes, and vice versa could be one way of taking that into account.
Yeah, I like your question a lot, because actually I worked also on, for instance, indigenous food consumption and also indigenous food production in different countries. Several reflections. The first reflection is what a student was researching a couple of years ago in Ethiopia, how more the indigenous foods became almost poor man's foods, but then how conflict made these poor man's foods all men's foods again. So it has also something to do about what do we think culturally appropriate food for who, under what conditions, and especially in heavily urbanization and when countries are developing to in their economic sense. So that's Ethiopia is a low income country. And then I lived and worked a long time in Vietnam. It's a high middle income country. And there actually the EAT-Lancet would portray Vietnam as the ideal company in terms of its diet. And it has a very, very healthy diet in terms of fruits and vegetables. You could also contest that because they use a lot of salt, sodium glutamate. But what we see, of course, we also talk about young people. We do a lot of research, and I also have a colleague here in the room also doing youth research about how diets shift. And it is not only because just there are large corporations and bringing in other kinds of products, it's also because their whole lifestyle is shifting. Mobility is shifting. So 20 years ago in Vietnam, everyone was on the bike, and now everyone is on the motorbike. So also the distances are changing. People are much more in digital spheres, so they're more sedentary kind of lifestyles, and also they engage with different types of influences. So, what is then at a certain point kind of indigenous? But on the other hand, like in Ethiopia, where I said, it was almost like indigenous food is poor man's food. In Vietnam, you have indigenous vegetable restaurants that fix very high prices, much higher than actually restaurants where Western foods are being offered. So this just adding to the complexity, yes, there is a lot of knowledge, there is a lot of traditional knowledge, there is a lot of traditional healthy diets going on, but at the same time, people's lifestyles are changing continuously. We are urbanizing very rapidly. So also these notions of what we think is at the moment culturally appropriate, or what is, what do we think is just for us, is also changing. So that makes it so super, super complex. And but I do think that we need to learn more from these more indigenous practices, also to be a bit more resilient in terms of what we can produce and what we can eat when, so to say, when the shit hits the fan. So, when there is a real problem in terms of climate change, for instance.
Actually, I am happy to contribute quickly to that. But first, it could be somehow very critical to understand what is traditional healthy diet and like how acceptable it can be a healthy diet, and what are the regulations. Because, like for example, in Gambia, where we have different cultural system, where we have different tribes that have their own specific food traditional diet, that they consume different from the other one. So it can be somehow really complex to understand universally what is, a healthy and a culturally healthy and acceptable diet. Even though it could be something that can be a progress towards how best we bring in some of these healthy diet and traditional healthy diet in the UN climate or food negotiation. I'm really interested to know about your own cultural food, and because I like food anyway, so it's actually yeah. So but it's really interesting to know that and how best we can bring in some of this traditional knowledge and how best we can promote this local perspective towards how we can influence some of the discussions and negotiations in the food system and health diet related food system anyway, because it is important for us to reflect on, because we're talking about local communities and indigenous knowledge, because issues about indigenous knowledge in the climate negotiation, even though it's somehow now people are promoting it, but it's not gaining the right momentum and recognizing the right approach for their approach and their advocacy to be included in competitions, because it's really important if you consider their knowledge and their experience, and it can influence policies and it can definitely help us in a real progressive world. Whereas some of these competitions like on people who are living with the realities of the
The dinner is getting close to the end. Is there anyone else who wants to join us at the table? Thank you so much for being part of our table. Because we talked a bit about these different voices that are there or not there. Which voices would you hope to hear this time at COP related to these issues that you've brought up? Food. That are maybe there, that you're really excited about, or that you would hope would be there to help with these issues that we've brought up so far?
I found it a difficult question, but it's an important question. First of all, I would like that they would create an event about people who have tried and learned and found, even small, some kind of solution to problems. So to invite people to pitch what they have tried and dealt with, because I think that are people with real experience, and what I also meant with my example of entrepreneurship. So people who try and deal with their feet in the mud. So what would it entail to mitigate climate change, but also to produce in such a way or to work in such a way that also it doesn't jeopardize climate change in the future. So I think that's an important one. And the second one, and I will be very brief because I can hand on to my neighbor, I would really like to have youth generations at the table. I think that is utterly important, and I also think it is arrogant to not have them at the table. I actually would give the microphone just to you to maybe strengthen.
Okay, cool. So first I will talk about, I don't know whether Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, that is FAO, is intensifying this advocacy to ensure that at least empower local community and smallholder farmers to bring in their food innovative ideas, because FAO contribute crucially in our agriculture and food system transformation and approaches, both locally and globally, because FAO is also funding a lot of projects and agricultural resilience projects back home in the Gambia. So having have first-hand experience with communities or smallholder farmers who are in the agricultural system, bringing in their voices and also having an exhibition like the Food and Agricultural Pavilion to bring in some of these people on the COP discussions to exhibit their ideas, their food and all that. It can definitely attract international attention to understand what those healthy diet and what those food and agriculture mean in the UN negotiation. And also smallholders, especially youth groups who are into agriculture and farming, because we really need to empower young people who are into the agricultural field. Because young people normally here, even in the Netherlands, people who are studying agriculture here, if you ask how many of them want to be farmers or operate their agricultural farms after graduating, it's very few. Because many people does not find agricultural farming attractive. And most people are leaving the agricultural farming sector because they feel like it is for the poor. But in Europe, that's the opposite here. You cannot do farming if you're poor. It's not for the poor. And we can invest more into climate smart agriculture, whereas it is not the defining moment of saying agriculture, food and agriculture. Though we understand in the global climate index, so emission index, agriculture also contributes a certain amount, I understand. But we can have a very smart approach, whereas, agriculture and food and agricultural production can be in a way that it limits global greenhouse gas emissions. And youth play a crucial role in transforming the food and agricultural sector. When they're empowered, giving the required tools, the knowledge they need, and also the capacity and finances, that will really help in that aspect.
I absolutely agree with my fellow panelists. I feel like you have really covered youth is crucial there, smallholder farmer voices, as well as I really like your point on the failures, those so-called failures. So what have we learned from the previous experiences and what has worked and maybe also what hasn't? What can be learned from that then? So also in addition to bringing new voices to the table, it would be interesting to have different formats that would actually, not people just wouldn't come to the tables with pre-written interventions that have gone back and forth through different tables and country representation and whatnot, but would actually be an exchange where you could foster learning, you could foster different ideas and really hear others as well. So that could be really interesting.
We're getting to the very end, so maybe I just have one last question for part of the panel. And because we had a nice dinner guest conversation, and as a dinner you go not to just speak with yourself but to learn from the others. So what I would like to know is what's something you take away that you learned from the others this evening about what is possible for food system transformations, COP and beyond. What do you take from the others in this conversation?
I can quickly just go in first. I feel like I've learned a lot from you two. Thank you so much for your great points and discussions. I think it was really interesting to answer, when you, for example, also mentioned that even in these negotiations, it's not really consensus based always, and how, that's the narrative that we're being told, and that this is the global will, so to say, on food system transition, but it is not necessarily true. That was a really good one. And then Sigrid, I think you have brought really good points, both on the demand side of things as well as the justice. Everyone needs to consider their own role as well, what they're playing. And yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I believe I was definitely also privileged to be here to learn from both of my colleagues as well as two gentlemen who also joined in. It was really amazing to hear different perspectives and different ideas to understand that the idea about food and agriculture need not to be just a discussion that we have to have occasionally. It has to be something that is in real action. So I understand that COP can be really complex. So bring in the immediate ideas like you mentioned. COP cannot solve all our problems, and that is true. But we also have a role to play to ensure that these narratives are discussed in our own local level, with our municipalities, with our governments, and understand these ideas to have the urgency in ensuring that food and agriculture get the attention and the urgent needs and priorities and demands in the COP negotiation, because we cannot bring in real solutions when we don't have legally binding agreements towards whatever we should do. Because these laws are there to save our actions. So we cannot do anything that is not in conformity with the law. So the COP need to provide that avenue for us to ensure that, as the International Court of Justice advisory opinion mentioned about I'm more particular about the CBDR, that is the common differentiated responsibilities and also respective capabilities, though we are all responsible in ensuring that we take action to climate change. But we are not all the same in taking responsibilities, like the disadvantaged and advantaged position, for example. So this is a very, very important position for us to ensure that the voices of indigenous knowledge, local communities, smallholder farmers, youth are intensified toward the UN climate discussions and also our own available pavilions as well. So thank you for sharing your point, and I've really learned a lot from that.
Yeah, I can only agree. It's a bit boring, but it's true. But you also made me think, especially your remark on different formats, and also related to learning, because we play. I'm in education. I work here at the university, and then we do a lot of gamification and role play to just jump into another perspective. And maybe that's what also the COP should happen. I think that could open up this power box that you rightly put on, because actually, do people have power, or do we provide them the power? So power is not something you have, power is something that you are granted. So that means that the people who grant certain power have power themselves, so to say. So I would challenge that we need different formats to play with this role of power, and then also you can play better, I think, with youth. And what you said is actually that what also made me think about the COP. Maybe it's not so much at the COP as it is in the end, and I'm still working in the university, indeed, on also in the education to keep young people interested in the sector, to pursue careers also within food systems. And I can only relate that when I work with smallholder farmers, not only in Africa but also in Asia, farmers want to have a stable income to bring their children to school so they don't have to become a farmer. And that is sad, yeah? So they go into banking systems. So they go into all these systems that keep the current food system in its lock-in position. So, and I think maybe there is where a lot of change can happen. So let the COP also go, but let's in due time just mind young people in their everyday lives and keep them interested in this very vital aspect of what makes us human. So that's food. And then to conclude, I would just say, we need to talk further, and we need to talk. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, thank you for this lovely conversation. Also, a lot of issues that unfortunately have not resolved in exam, but hopefully we brought them more tangibly to the table of what we're needing with what is needed with food and COP discussions. Keep talking, and I guess, Mira, do you want to close with any announcements related to table?
Yeah, thanks so much for a really interesting conversation. I also enjoyed it a lot. I hope you did too. I think we discussed so many different perspectives, and I think that's also seems really crucial to look at these different kinds of perspectives of youth, of indigenous knowledge, of maybe cities instead of nations. Thanks a lot for this conversation. So if you find it really interesting and would like to engage more with Table, there's another event coming in November. Also related to COP, and that's a bit rather kind of looking back, like what has COP, what can we learn from COP over the past 30 years, and visioning forward 30 years. So please, go to the Table websites and the events. You can find that as well. That one will be held in England. So that's for us that will only be online, which makes me realize that I don't think I mentioned that Table is a collaboration between several universities. So it's Wageningen, Oxford and SLU in Sweden, and recently also two Latin American universities joined from Mexico and University de los Andes in Colombia. I think you also all received this leaflet, so please check that out further. I think thing left is to really thank you for your contributions. And also thank Joaquin, who's hiding. We have, sorry, I didn't introduce you yet. He's a master student, international development studies here at Rethinking, and he has a master internship with Table, and was also a big hand in organizing this. And I think we have something for our Table guests.
But we can give them after, because we're close to 7, yeah.
We'll receive later, but as a token of appreciation, yeah, exactly. Or sharing the zucchini, yeah. Okay, so I think that's it. Thank you.